So my father began to pack things for this long journey, and he knew that it would be wise for him to take a good supply of food and other things to India. He found out how to pack jars of fruit in barrels by putting sawdust in between the jars. He would put a layer of sawdust, and then he would set jars of fruit or other food on that layer of sawdust, and then put sawdust in between each of the jars, and with a stick he would pound the sawdust down until it made a good solid packing for the fruit jars. And I helped him pack many jars, many barrels of jars of food to take to India. And what is amazing to me is eventually those barrels were rolled over and over, and yet when we finally opened up barrels in South India, more than 2 months later, we hardly found any jars were broken. And it was quite amazing to me as a young person. But I learned a lot just by watching my father pack things. He really was an excellent packer, and he knew what to do. And then, of course, in addition to taking food to India, there was clothing to take, and clothing for Ferne and me as growing children. I was 14 years old at the time we left India, and Ferne was younger, so clothing had to be taken for my father and mother as well as for Ferne and myself. And then a very important item for Ferne was her accordion. By that time she was very good in playing the accordion and singing, and by that time I had become quite qualified in my trumpet playing, so she had an accordion, I had a trumpet, and we took these instruments with us to India. Well, we arrived on board our freighter on a Saturday. Many of the saints from our church in Portland came out to tell us goodbye, and of course many family members. And those family members included my father's father, John Scism. He was there along with many other saints, and as our ship began to pull away from the dock, we were standing on board the ship and waving to people, and they were waving to us from below on the dock. Somebody asked my grandfather, that is my father's father, they said, "Brother Scism, how do you feel about your son Ellis leaving for India when you have no idea when he will return?" And he said something that we have never forgotten after all these years. He said, "I would rather see Ellis's bones bleach on the shores of India than for him to be out of the will of God." And we thought of that many times. And he had only 2 sons, and it was his son Ellis that really cared for him and did a lot for him. And now that son that cared for him so much was leaving for the other side of the world. And yet Grandpa Scism had such strong faith in God. He had truly had a wonderful conversion experience. So we found out just before leaving Portland that we were going to be going to Seattle first before we started across the Pacific Ocean. And we went ahead and got on board the ship. They told my father that since the ship is going to Seattle, you can just get on board in Portland and travel by ship to Seattle, and then we will leave from Seattle for India. So that's what we did. And Ferne, after she got on board the ship and the ship started down the river into the ocean, she discovered that her accordion was not working properly. And she was so disappointed. Here we were on the way to India, and now her accordion needed repair. So they called to our friends in Seattle, and interestingly enough, it was the father of Darlene Cantola who took the responsibility when our ship arrived in Seattle. By that time, he had already found out a good repair person in Seattle who could take care of her accordion problem. So he made arrangements to get that accordion when the ship arrived, and he took it to this repair service. And since we were there, docked for about 2 or 3 days in Seattle while they loaded rice, as I recall, they were loading some kind of rice equipment for Japan. And while this was being loaded, her accordion was repaired, and by the time we left, it was in excellent shape. So we were always grateful to Brother Cantola for helping Ferne with that very important job. And then, of course, we enjoyed fellowship with the saints in the church in Seattle as well. Well, it wasn't long until the day of our heading for the great Pacific Ocean came to pass, and we started across a sea in the month of January, and the sea was extremely rough. So as we entered the great Pacific Ocean, our ship was tossed back and forth in huge waves. Many of these waves were very, very high, and our freighter would roll back and forth and up and down, and there were 10 passengers on the ship in addition to all the crew, and all of these passengers were missionaries. Some of us were Pentecostal, and there were some who were Methodist. There were 2 ladies who had been in India for some years as Methodist missionaries. They were returning to India. And then in addition to our family, Lillian Anderson was with the Apostolic Church of Pentecost of Canada, and she was a Jesus Name missionary. She was going with us, and then there was a family called the Lamfiers, and they were going to Indonesia for the first time as missionaries in that country. So we had a group altogether of 10, and at the beginning of our journey, because the sea was so rough, we could not stay out on the deck most of the time it was dangerous because we would be possibly even tossed to one side of the deck or maybe even overboard if we weren't careful. So we stayed inside a lot until we arrived in Japan. That was a journey of 18 days. And I well remember as our ship was nearing Japan, and I could see for the first time in 18 days, I could see land in the future, on the horizon, and land was ahead, and I knew we were getting near our destination. So it was thrilling to arrive that night. It was already dark when we arrived in the harbor of Tokyo, and the next morning when we woke up in daylight, there we were tied up on the dock in Tokyo, and it was thrilling to see all of these Japanese people working on the dock. Their shoes were split-toe shoes. I'd never seen those before. And then one of the thrilling things was we saw a whole group of Japanese dressed in white, and they came out to welcome our ship and to welcome the missionaries. And we eventually, during our time in Tokyo, we were able to go visit our missionaries who lived in Tokyo, Japan, the brother and sister Nukita, and had a wonderful visit there. And then we eventually moved on to other cities of Japan because we were traveling by freighter and we had cargo to unload not only in Tokyo, but we had to go to Osaka and to Nagoya, and there were altogether 4 stops in Japan. And in all of these stops we had to unload cargo, and we had interesting experiences all along the way. But it was the last stop, which was Osaka, Japan, where we got off our ship and we had enough time to go to the headquarters for the American Army. And my dad was looking for a friend that he had made in the States from Japan, and he wanted to find out if he could possibly meet this Japanese pastor. So he went to the American headquarters to see if they had any idea where this Japanese pastor would be, because he had traveled in the United States also. Well, it was there that one of the officers took us high up on this American headquarters building so that we could get a view of Osaka. And it was just shocking as we looked from a high point over the city of Osaka. We could see the terrible destruction. Much of Osaka had been destroyed by the bombing, and that's something that as a young person I will never forget. Then we eventually got on our ship and we moved on to the next point. Well, that was just the beginning of a very long and interesting journey. It took us from Japan eventually to the Philippines. We went to the Philippines, and as we were entering the Manila harbor, we passed by Corregidor. Corregidor, of course, was a famous place by that time because that is where General MacArthur, before he left on a submarine, they took him on a submarine to Australia. But before he left, he said, "I will return." And so we saw Corregidor, we passed by Corregidor and heard a little of the history. And then our ship stopped. And we wondered, some of us wondered, why have we stopped here? And we were told that there are 170 ships that are sunken in the Manila harbor. Some of these ships, you could see the mast sticking up high or the funnel of the ship, but there were other ships completely submerged in the water. And so we had to have special guides to come out to our ship and guide us in and out between 170 sunken ships in the Manila harbor. And eventually they got our ship to the dock. And from Manila, we were taken to Cebu and Davao. And there was one other port in the Philippines. We stopped in 4 different places in the Philippines to unload and load cargo before we moved on. We also had a chance to meet some of our missionaries in the Philippines, and that was a very interesting and wonderful experience as well. It was in Cebu that my father purchased a very large ship, a very large shell that had a picture of our ship on it. And my father took this shell with the picture of our ship back on board, and he later had the officers of our ship sign their names on the back of the shell. And I still have that today. It's a wonderful, wonderful keepsake. So it was finally time to move on from the Philippines. We went to Hong Kong, and we enjoyed Hong Kong so much, and there we saw Brother and Sister McCune. They were missionaries, Jesus Name missionaries, that had been working for some time in Hong Kong, and we had a chance to spend a little time with them, and that meant a lot to us because we had known them from the Northwest. So from that journey, we moved on to Singapore. Our ship also went to Singapore, and we found this to be a very beautiful city, and we were able to get off and look around Singapore. And we also stopped in Davao. But anyhow, we made our way eventually to India and arrived there at a time when the Madras harbor was full of ships, unloading their cargo and loading cargo. So in the beginning, we were taken from our ship by a small boat to the dock where we got off and actually stepped onto the shore of India. And that was just the beginning of our time in India. And there were some missionaries there to meet us. Brother and Sister Nielsen from the Apostolic Church of Pentecost of Canada came really to meet Lillian Anderson, but they became wonderful friends of ours too. And later they helped us very much because they were missionaries in Kerala, which in those days was known as Travancore. They lived in Kottayam, and they became wonderful friends. And we've all loved them and appreciated them for a long, long time. So we were now in India, and it took some time for us to clear through customs and get the Jeep that my father had brought with him. It was an old army Jeep that he had purchased in Portland, and it had a body, extended body built on it by the father and son who had bought this army Jeep and made a longer body on it. They extended the body 1.5 feet to give a little more room for luggage, and that became our transportation for the first years we were in India. So it took time to get our Jeep cleared through customs and then find out how to get to Kodaikanal, because our first destination was to reach the school where Ferne and I would be put into boarding school in Kodaikanal, which was about 8,000 feet high in the mountains, one of the finest climates in the world, we were told. And it was beautiful. But that night, by the time we arrived at the foothills of the mountains taking us up to Kodaikanal, it was already dark. And as we started up this long mountain road of some 38 miles, one of our headlights went out. So we only had one headlight going around these winding roads in the mountains. And my father was afraid that a car coming, if they saw only one light, they might think it was a motorcycle and not realize that it was a car. So he gave one of us a flashlight and asked us to hold that out so that people coming towards us would realize there was more than a motorcycle there. So we tried to help my father drive up this long mountain road until we got up to the hill station of Kodaikanal. And there, once we got there, my father found where the house of the principal of our school was. His name was Mr. Phelps. And he went to the house. It was late at night by then, probably close to 10 o'clock, and knocked on the door of his house. And this principal was so kind. He had actually helped my father find a house. It was very difficult to get a place to rent in Kodaikanal because all the missionaries were up at that time. Most every place was taken. But it just so happened that there was a couple that were leaving for America, and they had left their house, and we were able to rent that house with the help of the principal. He arranged all of this. So he actually took us late in the night. He took us and showed us the road around the lake to get up to that house that we were renting. And that's how we got started in our living in Kodaikanal. Now I'm stopping for a breather.